I'd like to welcome to our Engage event, Dr. Susan Apkon. She has been the chair of this year's symposium and worked with MDA over the last several months to guide and advise us on the agenda and various aspects of the planning process. So thank you, Dr. Apkon. Dr. Apkon is the Fischahs chair, and I apologize if I said that wrong, in Pediatric Rehabilitation at Children's Hospital of Colorado, and professor and vice chair in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Colorado School of Medicine in Aurora, Colorado. Dr. Apkon earned her medical degree from the University of Vermont School of Medicine in Burlington, Vermont. She then completed a combined residency in pediatrics and physical medicine and rehabilitation at the Children's Hospital Colorado and the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Dr. Apkon is board certified in pediatrics, physical medicine and rehabilitation, and pediatric rehabilitation medicine. Dr. Apkon's professional career has been focused on the care of children and young adults with neuromuscular conditions. She co-directs the neuromuscular program at the Children's Hospital Colorado and provides clinical care in the many multidisciplinary clinics. As a rehabilitation medicine physician, Dr. Apkon has focused on the physical and cognitive impact of the specific neuromuscular conditions with a goal of improving a child's function abilities in collaboration with her therapy colleagues. Dr. Apkon's academic pursuits have been on the advancement of novel treatments for children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and spinal muscular atrophy. She's been a site principal investigator or co-investigator on over a dozen multi-center clinical trials and has published over 60 peer-reviewed journal articles, with the majority focused on topics related to neuromuscular conditions. We are so excited to have her here today, and I want to go ahead and turn the time over to you, Dr. Apkon, and then we will have questions at the end. But thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome, and thanks for the invitation to speak, Marissa. And I just want to start by thanking MDA. For those of you who are not aware, this is the first time that a symposium like this is being simultaneously translated into Spanish, something that is incredibly important to me as a physician. It's really important for all of my patients to have equal access to care and information, knowledge, especially when it has to do with novel treatments, like you heard about just a few minutes ago with Dr. Shea. Marissa, do you see a full screen before I jump in?
We do. Take it away.
Okay, wonderful. So it's wonderful to get to follow Dr. Shea's presentation. He talked about gene therapy, the excitement around it, some of the results that we're finding, some of the things that we are a little bit nervous about as it relates to some safety profiles. What I'm going to talk about is, as you as a parent or maybe a grandparent or you as an individual with a neuromuscular condition, what should you think about when you are considering participating in a clinical trial? What exactly is a clinical trial? I'll start with, because it's important, again, for you to make informed decisions as you pursue any of these novel clinical trials. These are just a few disclosures that I have, and I will jump in to defining what I mean by a clinical trial. And when I talk to kids about clinical trials, I talk to them about it being an experiment, and that really is the essence of a clinical trial. It is an experiment. It is the subject or the patient, the person who is part of the clinical trial is receiving some sort of intervention. And then the researchers, people like me, physicians, clinical researchers, are investigating. We're trying to figure out whether those interventions are safe, which has got to be the primary focus, and also effective. Are they doing what we think they're supposed to do? And we do that by measuring outcomes. Dr. Shea mentioned the North Star as a primary outcome measure. I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's a number of different phases of clinical trials. Dr. Shea shared some of the gene therapy trials, phase 2 and 3 trials. Before a trial can even get to a phase 1, 2, or 3, There's preclinical work that's done. And when you hear someone refer to preclinical work, what we're talking about is work that's being done in the lab. They're generally animal studies. We in the world of Duchenne muscular dystrophy are really fortunate that we have animal models. So animals, mice that actually have a Duchenne-like condition. And so we're able to test or experiment with these novel interventions using animals before we bring them to people. There's other animals models that we can use, like dog models or even non-human primates. Once the researchers deem that there's safety and there may be some efficacy in the animal models or the preclinical studies, then it moves on to human studies. Phase 1 studies oftentimes are conducted with healthy volunteers. In the setting of a super rare condition like Duchenne, phase 1 studies may involve boys with muscular dystrophy. The focus of a phase 1 study is really on safety. The duration of these studies could be weeks or even months. So they're very quick. When there's just a focus on safety, they do it very quickly to assure it's safe before they move it on. At the very bottom of this box, what you see is that not all drugs or interventions move on to the next phase, only about 70% of them. That means that 30% of them were deemed to be unsafe to pursue, and so they are discontinued. A phase 2 trial is basically a study that's gathering early data that's looking on dosing, so the high dose or low dose of a particular medication, short-term safety of that medication, and again, the effectiveness of that. Now, the length of the phase 2 studies are much shorter. The ones that we're talking about, Dr. Shea talked about, oftentimes are 1 year. Some of them could even be shorter, months to years. Again, not all trials that are phase 2 move forward to a phase 3. Only about a third of those that begin as a phase 2 will move forward. And that's because either they weren't deemed to be safe or they weren't deemed to be effective. And then finally, phase 3 trial. It occurs if phase 2 is positive. Again, additional information is gathered on the safety and the effectiveness, but this includes much larger numbers of patients. Now, when we talk about phase 3 trials of maybe blood pressure medicine or a medication for diabetes, those are incredibly common conditions. So when we look at the number of people who are enrolled in a phase 3 trial, we could be talking about thousands of patients. In the world of rare disorders like Duchenne, spinal muscular atrophy, the limb-girdle muscular dystrophies, we're talking about 20, 30, 50, or 100 in some of the phase 2, and even the phase 3 may be only slightly larger than that. The duration of those studies are longer, could be upwards of 4. You'll hear the expression OLE, or open label extension. So those are studies that continue on oftentimes until the FDA reviews the results of those trials and determines whether or not it will get FDA approval or not. So open label extension is a way that a child or a person receiving an intervention may be able to continue to receive it without FDA approval. And again, only about 25 to 30% will move on to the next phase. And that last phase is a phase 4 study. So the FDA has approved the drug. They have deemed it safe. They have deemed it effective. And it is now FDA approved. And so I, as a physician, can write a prescription. You can go to a pharmacy and get that medication, or come to our infusion center and receive it as an infusion. But those studies continue, and they focus on long-term safety. Remember, some of the earlier phases were only looking at a year's worth or 2 years worth of data. And so once it's FDA approved, we want to be able to follow people years out to determine whether there are new safety concerns or the safety concerns that we identified early on are still the ones that we're watching. So as we talk about a clinical trial, and I'm sitting in the clinic setting and I speak with a family about a potential clinical trial that might be available to their son, I'll talk a little bit about the protocol. And so what I mean by that, protocol is a very long document. It's oftentimes 50, 60, 70 plus pages long. It is a document that details in fine detail the plans of the study. It provides the background of the study or the rationale. So for example, if it's an agent that might decrease fibrosis in the muscle, it will talk about the fact that in a dystrophic muscle, as the muscle breaks down, it's replaced by fibrosis or fat. And so the rationale with using an anti-fibrotic agent is to decrease some of that fibrosis. So the rationale or the background is included. The design of the study is included. I'll talk about this a little bit in a later slide. But what I mean by that is the study observational. Is it randomized, placebo-controlled? Or is it an open label where everyone gets the study drug? How long is the study? So the duration of the study, is it 12 weeks? Is it 24 weeks? Is it 52 weeks? Is it 2 years? Or again, for some of these phase 4 studies, they may go on infinitum. The inclusion and exclusion criteria within the protocol defines who can be enrolled in the study. There were some questions after Dr. Shea's presentation wondering about who could be included in the studies. You have to have a specific mutation. He explained that boys with early genetic changes may not be eligible for some of the gene therapy trials because of a concern for an increased immune response. So the inclusion criteria typically describes the age of the child, the stage of the child. Do they have to be ambulatory or could they be non-ambulatory? What are their scores on the North Star, or if they're non-ambulatory, the performance of the upper limb? And so do you have to be on steroids or do you have to be steroid naive? Those are all inclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria are those criteria that exclude someone from participating, meaning if you have been involved or you are already involved in a clinical trial, you may be excluded. If you have other medical conditions, you may be excluded. I had a young man who we excluded from a gene therapy trial because he had some additional cardiac involvement separate from his Duchenne, but could have impacted the safety if he were included. So that's he was excluded because of that. Dr. Shea mentioned the efficacy measures. So again, how do we know that this drug is actually of benefit to the child or the adult taking it? So in the ambulatory boy, we frequently look at time function testing. So how fast it takes you to get up off the ground, to climb 4 stairs, to walk or run 10 meters. How far can you go in 6 minutes? It also, for the non-ambulatory boy or man, it may look at the upper limb. And I just mentioned, and Dr. Shea mentioned the PUL, the Performance of Upper Limb 2.0. Again, it's a assessment of the function of the upper limb in someone who is not walking. We look at safety assessments a lot. So we are drawing blood, we are checking urine, we are doing EKGs and echoes, we might be doing cardiac MRIs. And if we see abnormal results, we may check it again. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the logistics of being a participant in a clinical trial. And finally, the protocol talks about the schedule of events. So what you as an individual participating in the trial and I as a principal investigator of the trial should expect at baseline, at screening, at baseline, at week 1, week 2, and thereon. So this next slide, just so you can get a sense, this particular trial, there were 3 pages worth of study visit descriptions. So the screening will include things like getting the informed consent, vital signs, height and weight, the North Star. Then there's a lot of blood work included, including this one included a muscle biopsy, patient reported outcome measures. So that's a lot of surveys that as a participant or a parent you might be filling out, some wearable devices, and so forth. So these are very complicated clinical trials, and it's important to note within the protocol what the expectations are before, during, and after the interventions. So the study design, I mentioned observations. So these are generally we think of as natural history studies. There's no intervention, there's no drug treatment, there's not a gene therapy, there's not an antisense oligonucleotide, there's not an antifibrotic treatment. This is just me observing you and following the course of your condition, whatever the condition might be. There's a lot of natural history studies within Duchenne muscular dystrophy and other neuromuscular conditions, and they help inform us as to expectations over time. There are treatment designs, and this is really what we're talking about today. We're going to hear from a panel of industry partners about the different treatment trials that they have, that this is giving you an intervention. It could be a drug, it could be a therapy. So as a rehab physician, I might be participating in a trial looking at the use of a novel therapy technique, a novel therapy device, and following you over time with that as the intervention. Randomized clinical trial is something you hear a lot about. So randomized meaning it's a flip of the coin, whether you get the intervention or you are in the placebo arm or the control arm. That's the other term we use. Double blind means you don't know what arm you're in and I don't know what arm you're in. The therapists who are doing the evaluations, the research assistants who are participating, none of us know whether you're getting the study drug or a placebo. Single blind may be that you don't know, but I know, or vice versa. And non-blinded or open label means that we all know. Now, the reason for the double blind, and it's upsetting to many, including me at a basic level, question always comes up, why can't we all just receive the drug? When that happens is we enter a lot of bias into the evaluation. If I know someone's getting a drug and I'm a therapist, as an example, or a physician, I'm assessing using these outcome measures, I may be biased in favor or perhaps against that intervention. And so blinding us takes away that bias. Non-randomized just means that certain group of people will be put in and not in a random flip of the coin kind of way. And I already talked about placebo-controlled. So I'd like to transition now to, again, this whole idea of this presentation was what should you know as a family member or a potential participant in a clinical trial. So I'd like to talk about your roles and responsibilities as a participant or a family member. I think the most important thing to understand is the nature of the study. But what is the goal of the study? What are the tests and treatments involved? Again, is this a placebo-controlled, or is this an intervention or an observation? What is the frequency and duration of the visits? A one-time visit is very different than from a weekly visit, or if the intervention is a weekly infusion, that's very different than taking a pill every day. And it's important to understand how frequent these interventions are and the visits will be, as well as the duration, meaning how long will this study go on? Again, 12 weeks, 24 weeks, 52 weeks, 2 years. I think what's incredibly important is for you to understand the potential adverse events or serious side effects that you or your child might experience. When I sit down and do an informed consent, and the most recent one I've been doing is probably 30 plus pages long, it has taken over 2 hours to go over that informed consent. And I spend a lot of time talking about the potential for safety-related issues. Clinical trials are voluntary. Regardless of whether or not you participate, I, as your physician or your local physicians, are going to provide great care. And so if you volunteer to participate in the trial, it's really important for you to understand the potential for side effects. And then the final responsibility is this idea of providing informed consent and ASENT. So an ASENT is the little boy, or depending on the institution, it might be a boy over 6 or a boy over 8 or even older, will provide their willingness to participate in the trial. They obviously at their age don't have the full ability to consent to this. You can't consent really until you're over 18, but we want to make sure they understand what the study is involving, and it's the parent or the legal guardian that will consent. One of the bullet points was understanding the impact of participation in a clinical trial. I wanted to spend a few minutes on this particular slide because I think this one is especially important. There's a lot involved with participating in a clinical trial. I showed you the 3 pages of activities that will occur over each of the different visits and weeks. It takes a lot of time. And it's time away from your child's participation in school. It may be your time away from work, and it may be time away from other family members. And that's something that as you try to navigate the decision-making process, you want to make sure you fully understand commitment. I included money up here. Now, in general, clinical trials are paid for by the sponsors, the industry partners who are paying for all of the study-related activities. So if you need a blood draw, they will pay for the blood draw, urine, MRIs, the PT assessments. All of that is generally covered. Even travel. We have a family that came from out of state to participate in one of our trials, actually tomorrow. And his family's travel is being paid for. They're going to be staying in a hotel for a week, and food and all that is covered. But there are things that won't be covered, right? If you have to leave other kids at home and you need babysitters at home for them, that's not covered. Time away from work is not covered. So if you have paid time off, that's great. But many people in this country work on an hourly wage. And if you don't work, you don't get paid. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. I wrote the word emotions down. I wasn't entirely sure how to best put this. But think about this idea of participation in a placebo-controlled trial. And your son or you get the placebo. And having to wait a year to roll into a treatment arm. And what I mean by that is some studies, not all, it will be blinded at the beginning, and if you receive the placebo in that first year, in that second year, you will be rolled into an intervention study. You'll actually get the study drug. But not knowing whether or not you get the study drug can be very emotionally trying. That's what families have shared with me. Putting your kid through a lot of interventions, knowing that they may be receiving a placebo. Travel's just hard these days, right? If any of you have been to an airport, got on a plane, hopefully it left on time, but they're not all, flights aren't all leaving on time. That adds a level of stress now to everyone's life. And so again, the finances associated with the travel per se, the flights, the transport to and from your house or to and from the hotel, those are covered, but just the sheer exhaustion of the travel is something that needs to be understood in terms of the impact it might have on you or your child. And then the last bullet is unexpected additions to expected schedule. So again, I showed the slide with 3 pages of study visits. What I didn't include is if your child has an adverse event, if they have a complication associated with the study intervention. Dr. Shea talked about some hospitalizations of children with the gene therapy. So those are additional visits on top of the already taxing schedule. Now, I don't want to leave you on sort of a down note. Participating in a clinical trial can have some incredible positive impacts on you and your child, but it's so important to understand the total picture before you make a decision. So here are some of the benefits, right? So if you participate or your kid participates in a clinical trial, that means if they're getting the intervention, you're able to access that experimental drug before the FDA even approves it, right? So you may have the intervention at an earlier age. Dr. Shea mentioned earlier treatment with drugs probably is better than later treatment. So participation may give you early access. Participation in a clinical trial also provides expert medical care. What I mean by that is you're seeing me or my colleagues across the country or internationally a lot. So if something comes up between visits, you're able to ask us about it. We're able to give you some advice instead of waiting the 6 months for regular clinical care. There's a greater good to participation in a clinical trial. You're helping others by contributing to medical research. While your child may not fully benefit, it might help inform future trials. And certainly some of the early trials did that. We learned a lot about outcome measures. And probably the outcome measures that we picked early on were not the best, or maybe the design of the trial or the inclusion and exclusion criteria were not the best, and so we didn't see the positive results that we expected. But that certainly has helped inform us about how to design a clinical trial now. And then finally, participation in a clinical trial is basically you assuming an active role. You're being active in managing your own healthcare, and that's especially important. We talked about risks already. Dr. Shea mentioned there could be serious, even life-threatening side effects to experimental drugs. There are always things we don't know, and that is in the informed consent. It says that your child may experience some side effects that we don't know about at this point. There was a death associated with participation in a clinical trial. So unbelievably devastating. And it's important as you consent to participation that you're aware of that. The drug that you've been taking over the entire year or 2 years may not be effective in the end. And that phase 2 study or even phase 3 study may not move forward. And finally, I already said it, the protocol may be just time intensive, and understanding the time it takes is important, and that's certainly a risk. So let's spend just a few minutes talking about the informed consent. I shared with you, they are long. I spend a couple of hours for some of these trials reviewing them with families. The consent talks about the purpose of the research, what procedures will be done. It describes in detail the risks and potential benefits. It describes alternative treatments, so continuation of corticosteroids, for example, or if you are amenable to exon skipping that's FDA approved, it's something we'll talk about as we're reviewing the informed consent. We talk a lot about HIPAA and how you or your child's information will be safely handled or managed. It will describe the cost of participation. It will provide contact information for the investigators and the sponsor. And most importantly, it will provide you with adequate time to ask questions. This is especially important. During my consenting process, I give frequent breaks to ask for specific questions as we're going through it. And at the very end, I am there to answer those questions. And until that last question is asked and answered, we will sit in the clinic room. It's also important, again, we have many of our participants in today's webinar are Spanish speaking. It is very important that the consent be done in your native language. It is not appropriate for me to do a consent form in in my very poor Spanish. And so if you are not someone who feels very comfortable with the written or spoken language, English, then it's really important that you reach out and ask for an interpreter, and we must provide that to you if we're really getting informed consent signed. I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about some of my roles and responsibilities. First and foremost, it is to provide expert clinical care. So if you are seen in our clinic here at Children's Hospital Colorado, whether you participate in our clinical trials or not, we as a team are going to provide expert clinical care. If you want to participate in the clinical trial, fabulous, we'll help facilitate it. But if you choose not to or ultimately drop out of the study, we will continue to provide expert clinical care. Our job is to work with the sponsors, so our industry partners, to bring trials to patients. We have to submit the protocol to our local IRB, stands for Institutional Review Board. And so we have to get approval from our own institutions. The IRB assures that patients are kept safe during clinical trials, and that we have the ability as an institution to carry out the clinical trial in a safe way. And we are following all the compliance and regulatory requirements that the study requires, and is required nationally and even internationally. Our job is to negotiate a budget to cover the costs associated with it. So I talked about, the different tests. We want to make sure that if an MRI is part of the protocol, that is covered through the sponsor, and that you will not receive any charges for an MRI to your insurance company or to you personally. It's our job to recruit and enroll patients. In our clinic setting, we want to make sure that every clinic visit, when we see kids every 6 months, we're talking about what clinical trials they might be eligible for. And then as those trials get up and running, we want to make sure that if families are interested, we are helping to recruit and enroll them. We help conduct the study in collaboration with a big team of research coordinators, research supervisors, research nurses, research pharmacists. It really takes a village to be able to fully and completely conduct a research trial. And finally, maintaining the integrity of the study. If you're supposed to come in at week 2, plus or minus a day, we want to make sure you're here at that time period and not come outside of the window, because that decreases the integrity of the study, which the reason I bring that up is it can make then the results of the study less valid. The sponsors are responsible for the research and development of the trial drug. They help design the study, they finance the study, they hire a CRO, that's a clinical or contract research organization. They're the ones that help kind of bridge from the sponsor to the investigators and help assure that the trial is able to be delivered, again, in the correct way. They also work with the FDA to bring that trial drug, if effective and if safe, to the market, so that, again, I as a physician can write a prescription and deliver that drug to your child or you yourself. And finally, the FDA is the regulatory agency at the national level that assures that introduction of any new drug is safe and effective. It works with the sponsors across the entire life cycle of a clinical trial, so the preclinical development all the way through the approval process and beyond. And then there are some accelerated approval processes, and they work with sponsors to help potentially get treatments out earlier if this is a treatment of a serious condition. They will help support that. So I'm going to end with this last slide, and this is if you are interested in having your child or you yourself participate in a clinical trial, this is the go-to, I think, place. www.clinicaltrials.gov. And as you can see here, this is the sort of the face page. You type in the condition, and then you search all studies, and up will pop multiple studies. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my PowerPoint, and I'm going to see if this magic works. Marissa, let me know.
Okie doke.
I'm gonna go ahead and just log on to the clinical trials website so you can see how and what I do. I do this sometimes in the clinic setting. Okay, I'm going to just share this again. Okay, Marissa, you seeing the clinical trials website up now?
I do.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just type in Duchenne. And what you're going to see, there are 344 studies that are listed. I'm just going to walk you through what I look at. There is a tab for the status, or a column for the status. So active means the study is going on, but they're not recruiting. What that generally means is that they've completed enrollment. So if they were going to enroll 50 patients or 100 patients, they are fully recruited. The next column is a study title. This is a phase 3 trial of a medication that's going to be used in combination with steroids in the treatment of non-ambulatory boys with Duchenne. And then these are the locations of those clinical trials. So I'm gonna just click on this, and I am not in any way supporting this particular trial, but this happened to be the first one up, so I'm gonna just use it so you can see. There's a description of the study. So this is to evaluate the efficacy and safety of this particular drug versus a placebo in boys who are also on steroids who are non-ambulatory. It talks a little bit about some additional details. It talks about the screening period, the treatment period, and safety follow-up. Moving down, it talks about the design. So this is an interventional study. There will be 90 participants. They will be randomized. And it is placebo-controlled. So the participants, the care providers, the investigator, and the outcome assessors, the physical therapists, won't know whether they're getting a drug or not. It talks about the start dates, the hope for a completion. It talks about the aims of this study, the outcome measures. So we talked about the performance of upper limbs. So here's the POL 2.0 is the primary outcome measure. It talks about the eligibility criteria. So this is for boys who are 12 and older. They have to be they have to have confirmed Duchenne. They have to have, this is the Brooks score, is a score of the upper limbs. They have to be able to undergo an MRI test. They have to be able to perform pulmonary function testing. There's some health-related issues that have to be met. And then exclusion criteria, if they have a high weight, they won't be able to participate. If they've been exposed to other clinical trials, they have to wait to be screened for at least 30 days. And so there's some other ones, other exclusion criteria. And then finally, the contexts and locations. So this is a long list of the study locations. You can see actually Colorado is a study participant here. Oftentimes there's actually a link to that actual study research coordinator, or who you can contact. If there's not a particular one, oftentimes at the very bottom, sorry, you can close your eyes. There will be other information about who you can reach out to. So I'm going to stop sharing there, but again, I encourage people to get familiar with the clinical trials website. So I'd like to summarize, and then I'm excited to be able to answer some questions. Participation in a clinical trial is an exciting opportunity for boys and men with Duchenne and other neuromuscular conditions. It's important to remember it's an experiment. We're doing the clinical trial because we do not know whether it's safe or effective. The preclinical data, the animal data, suggests it's safe and suggests it may be effective, but the clinical trial is done to be able to truly understand in boys and men with Duchenne. There's a lot of logistical challenges to participating in a clinical trial. It's not to say that you should be dissuaded from participating. It's just to say you should know what they are. What are the details of the study? Make sure it's going to work for you and your family. And finally, if you're interested in learning more about clinical trials, you yourself can search under the clinical trials website. I'd encourage you, however, to reach out to your care providers. We talked about the details around inclusion and exclusion, the background of these trials. It's important for you to have a conversation with your care providers, your entire team, as to whether or not there are trials that would your child would be eligible for, whether or not it makes sense for your child to participate, what the expectations might be if they participate. And again, finally, participation in a clinical trial is voluntary. And we will always provide the expert care regardless of whether you participate. We just want to be able to support you and your family if you're interested in participation in clinical trials. So I will end there, and Marissa, hand it back to you and see if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Apkon. It does look like we have a question. Are DMD studies of gene therapies generally placebo-controlled, or are they open label versus historical cohorts as they are in SMA?
Yeah, the majority are placebo-controlled. Some of the early phase studies in Duchenne are open label. So when the first phases, when we're looking primarily at safety, those are often open label, so your child will be getting study drug. But when we go into some of the phase 2 and certainly 3, they are, for the most part, placebo-controlled trials. And I will say the early SMA trials, the very early trials were open label for the infants. And the reason is for the infants with SMA, as many of you may know, it is a very fast progressing disease with life expectancy to a year or 2 of age. And so to have a placebo-controlled trial in an infant, we couldn't wait the year or 2 because that child who got the placebo would have passed. And so for that population, it's different. I will say now with, there's a lot of additional clinical trials for children with SMA who are older, and they are placebo-controlled as they are for Duchenne.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the chat here. Please feel free to type in your questions, either using the chat function or the Q&A box. Give people just a few more minutes.
And I would ask if anyone in the audience has participated in a clinical trial or their child has participated. If there were some logistics or things that I didn't actually bring up, I would love to hear from you, lessons learned to share with the audience.
I love that. That's a great idea. Anybody has anything to share?
Yeah, as we're waiting, I just wanted to make another quick comment. I do believe that there are a lot of barriers to participation in clinical trials. I mentioned one. If you are a parent of a child with Duchenne and you work at a job where you're paid by the hour and don't have vacation days to take off, it can be really challenging. Sometimes clinical trials require you to put out money ahead of time for hotels and airfare and so forth. Fortunately, that's changed a lot, but if you don't have the ability to put out a sum of money, then that would be a barrier. If you live in a rural community, to travel to a clinical site, that can be a real barrier to participation. I'm happy to be able to say that the sponsors, those who design the trials in collaboration with stakeholders like families or study participants, with providers like me, there's a lot of recent discussions about how we can improve access for all families, for all boys, with Duchenne, we can take away some of the barriers, make it easier, maybe do local lab draws. So having nurses come to your house so you don't have to take a day off to come to see me. To use prepaid credit cards, to give people credit cards that are loaded so that you don't have to put out your own cash for lunches or gas or hotel. So there are some things that I believe that the sponsors, our industry partners, are doing to really make it more accessible. There's a lot more that we can do, but I'm excited that things seem to be changing over the last year or so, or last couple of years.
No, that's very exciting. I'm glad to hear that that's happening more and more. Looks like another question. Do we know everything there is to know about Duchenne? For example, how the different deletions affect certain boys differently, or why it seems to progress faster in some boys?
Oh my gosh, that's such a wonderful question. And I wish I could say, yes, we know absolutely everything. But the reality is we have so much more to learn about Duchenne. What you're describing is something called a genotype phenotype. And what I mean by that is the genetic changes in some boys may predict their clinical picture. So we do have some of that information. We understand that some gene changes have a milder clinical picture, where some have a more severe. We're having a greater understanding of some of the cognitive behavioral manifestations of our boys and young men with Duchenne. Some are related to the genetic changes, others we see in many boys. And that's really important as we think about clinical trials. There's also some genetic modifiers. So these are other maybe genes in our body that may modify the dystrophin gene to again make one boy have a more mild clinical picture and another one with a more severe. So there's a lot to learn about Duchenne. Things, we're gaining knowledge every day, but there's still so much to know. And MDA, I think, has a lot to be proud of in terms of helping to fund many of the certainly early work as well as the ongoing work to help us better understand what's going on.
Thank you. Looks like a comment. One of the attendees said, my son was about to start a clinical trial and it was put on hold right before he got the biopsy done. It was the first time they had gotten information in regards to a clinical trial, and she gave it a try to sign him up. Everything looked promising, and unfortunately it's still on hold. Do you have any thoughts on families where it's put on hold, they've gone the extra mile, they've signed up for this, and now it's on hold?
Yeah, I'm so incredibly sorry that happened. And it's happened a number of times. There's been families who have participated in the middle of a trial. The trial's just stopped. It's not even put on hold, it's stopped. And the sponsor just doesn't move forward. When studies are put on hold or studies are stopped short, when studies are put on hold, it's generally a safety-related issue. So as a physician first, so not even talking about someone who does clinical trials as a researcher, I am a clinician first. And so I actually am happy when someone, an industry sponsor, is willing to sort of say, we have to put a stop to this, because what they're saying is we have concerns about the safety of our children participating in this clinical trial, and we need to understand better what's going on. And so while it's unbelievably frustrating, and I remember that bullet I had about emotions, that's some of what I'm talking about, like this up and down of participation in the clinical trial. Right before your son was getting his biopsy, things shut down, and it's hard to predict. When that happens, it's done generally again because of safety-related concerns, and so that's so important. And I know families have tried to push through that, but as a physician first, I'm equally frustrated, but also supportive when that happens, because I too want to make sure we understand how we can best keep kids safe when we're doing these clinical trials.
Sorry, Try to put on a headset, see if it's a little clearer for everybody. Thank you. There's another question in here. It says, are there any studies on duplications? And if so, how many?
Yeah, so there's some work that's being done at Nationwide Children's Hospital looking at some duplications. I don't know the status. It is not broadly sort of being rolled out in sort of the more traditional clinical trials sort of world. So there, I believe, are some clinician initiated trials at Nationwide that you, again, would encourage you to talk with your care providers about and whether it's the right potential trial for your son.
Great advice. I'm seeing if there's any more questions here. Looks like we just had one more pop up. Looks like somebody's wondering about any kind of connection between Duchenne and autism.
Yes, and that's a long, it's sort of a long answer, but very briefly, I mentioned that we have a greater understanding now of some of the cognitive behavioral types of manifestations of Duchenne. So while we think about Duchenne or dystrophin, so that's that protein that's missing in the muscle, Dr. Shea had showed that cartoon picture. While dystrophin we think about as just being in the muscle, the reality is there are dystrophin isoforms. Those are forms of dystrophin that are produced in the brain. As a result, we see very common types of cognitive behavioral manifestations. So anxiety, some attentional issues, and kids who have autistic-like features. Again, there's some gene changes that tend to be a little bit more commonly represented when we look at the kids with autism or intellectual disability. And so there is a fair amount of ongoing work being done to help us better understand this. But if you have not spoken with your care provider, either your neurologist, a rehab physician, or even a psychologist about this, I would encourage you to do so because I think that there are some things that you can learn and how to help support your son in the best way possible.
Great. It looks like the person that posed this question also was wondering if for a clinical trial, if her son has autism and Duchenne, will that exclude him from clinical trials?
Not necessarily. So one of the inclusion criteria is if you get on the clinical trials website, almost every clinical trial will require the child to be able to participate consistently in the study outcome measures. So their tests that are done in the clinic setting all the time, right? So my guess is you go to a center that the PT asks your child to walk or run 10 meters or climb stairs or get up off the ground and they time them. The child who participates in a clinical trial has to be able to consistently do those types of skills to participate in a clinical trial. And it makes sense, right? We want to test a drug, and if the outcome measure is walking faster over 10 meters, we have to have it baseline a good measure to be able to compare it to a year later. And so if a child, whether they have an intellectual disability or significant anxiety or attentional issues, or even autistic-like features, if they aren't able to participate with the physical therapist consistently each visit, then it will be really hard for them to participate in a clinical trial. But there are things you can do to try to get your kid ready for it. So we will send kids home with, the therapist will send the kids home, parents home, with the list of tests that we'll be doing in the clinical trial so they can practice them, or maybe they can practice them with their local therapist. And some kids will actually, while they have attentional issues and a lot of behavioral issues when they're younger, as they get older, they seem to do better. And so every time I see a child in the clinic setting, I will reevaluate their ability to participate in a clinical trial. And it's been wonderful. There are kids who at baseline, I was not able to consider them for a clinical trial, and a year or two later, they're able to do it. And that's something that I encourage you again to talk to your care provider about.
Well, Dr. Apkon, thank you so much.